The story of the Library of Alexandria survivors begins not with fire, but with silence, the kind of silence that follows the collapse of something so vast that even memory struggles to hold its shape, and in the shadow of that silence there were a few who walked away carrying more than their lives, carrying fragments of a world that once believed knowledge could be made eternal if it was written down and guarded carefully enough. Among them was a young scribe named Callisthenes, whose duty had been to copy scrolls from the eastern wing of the library where texts from Egypt, Persia, India, and Greece were kept side by side as if the world itself had agreed, briefly, to speak in one intellectual language, and on the night the unrest reached the great harbor city of Alexandria, he was cataloging astronomical charts that described planets the Romans had never named and stars that sailors used like secret maps, and when the first flames were seen reflecting off the harbor water he did not believe they were real, because the library was not supposed to burn, it was supposed to outlive empires, but reality does not negotiate with belief. And soon the corridors filled with smoke and shouting and the grinding panic of scholars who had never learned how to flee what they had spent their lives preserving. Callisthenes was not alone, for beside him was an older keeper named Ilias of Tyre, a man whose memory was said to be so precise that he could recite entire scrolls after reading them once, and Ilias understood immediately that no physical archive could be saved, so he did something that seemed both irrational and divine at the same time. He ordered the younger scribes to unroll and read aloud the most critical texts as quickly as possible, believing that knowledge spoken into human memory might survive where parchment could not, and in that chaotic night under burning beams and collapsing shelves, voices rose in a strange chorus of preservation, mathematics, poetry, medical treatises, philosophical debates, and ancient myths being forced into living minds like seeds pressed into soil before a storm. Callisthenes remembered later that it felt like swallowing the sky, too vast to contain but too precious to refuse, and when the final section of the library fell and ash turned the courtyard into a blackened snow, the survivors emerged not as scholars of a building but as carriers of a lost civilization encoded in human thought. They scattered in different directions, as instructed by Ilias, who believed that concentration was vulnerability, and so the knowledge was divided like a shattered mirror carried across continents, and Callisthenes traveled south into Egypt first, hiding among merchants and caravan guides, pretending to be nothing more than a translator of minor languages while in his mind entire libraries continued to speak, equations of geometry that described impossible curves, medical remedies derived from plants that grew only in distant valleys, and philosophical arguments about justice that made rulers uncomfortable even in memory. Years passed, and Alexandria became a story people told with disbelief, a myth of excessive learning punished by fate or politics, depending on who was speaking. But the survivors knew better, because they were the myth's last witnesses, and they began to notice something unexpected. Memory was not static, it evolved, and each time they recalled a passage, it shifted slightly, not corrupting but refining, like metal shaped repeatedly under heat, and so what remained of the library was not a frozen archive but a living, changing body of knowledge that continued to grow even in exile. Ilias of Tyre, who had gone east toward the Levant, formed a secret circle of scholars in hidden courtyards and underground chambers where texts were reconstructed from collective memory, and these gatherings became known among themselves as the second reading, not because they were rewriting history but because they were re-speaking it into existence, and they discovered that collaboration restored precision, as one man's fading memory was corrected by another's clarity, and together they rebuilt fragments of lost scrolls with surprising accuracy, especially in mathematics and astronomy, where structure resisted distortion. Meanwhile Callisthenes, traveling through desert trade routes, encountered an unexpected problem. He could no longer fully distinguish between what he had read and what he had imagined during moments of fear, and this blurred boundary terrified him at first, until an elderly Nubian caravan leader told him that knowledge without transformation is only storage, not wisdom, and that perhaps the library's true survival was not in preservation but in adaptation, a thought that slowly reshaped Callisthenes' understanding of his burden. Years later, he reached a coastal settlement where Greek, Egyptian, and Phoenician traders mixed languages as easily as currency, and there he began teaching what he remembered, but not as rigid doctrine. He taught it as living inquiry, inviting correction, discussion, and expansion, and in doing so he unintentionally created a new form of intellectual transmission that did not depend on scrolls at all but on dialogue, and this method spread quietly, influencing merchant schools, navigational training, and eventually early philosophical circles that valued questioning over memorization. Ilias, on the other hand, faced a different evolution of the same legacy, because his group of scholars began to realize that perfect recall was less important than interpretive synthesis, and so they started combining fragments from different disciplines, merging medical knowledge with astronomy to track seasonal disease patterns, and blending poetry with mathematics to create mnemonic structures that preserved complex information more effectively than plain recitation, and this hybridization became a defining trait of what they called living scholarship, a term that would later echo faintly in medieval learning traditions without anyone remembering its origin. But the most profound discovery came when both branches of survivors, separated by geography but connected by memory, independently reached the same conclusion. The Library of Alexandria had not been destroyed in a single moment, it had been redistributed across human minds, and in that redistribution it had become impossible to locate but also impossible to erase. Decades passed, and the survivors aged, and new generations began to learn from them, not through formal institutions but through apprenticeship and storytelling. And Callisthenes, now an old man, often sat by the sea watching ships arrive from unknown lands, thinking about how many of them unknowingly carried echoes of forgotten texts in their navigation techniques, their medical supplies, their legal customs, all subtly influenced by fragments of what once stood in Alexandria. He sometimes wondered whether the fire had truly been an ending or whether it had been a transformation that no one at the time could recognize, and Ilias, in a distant inland city, reached a similar conclusion as he listened to young students debating ideas that clearly had multiple ancestral sources yet no single origin point, and he realized that the greatest irony of the library's destruction was that it had achieved what no empire could. It had made knowledge borderless. In their final years, both men recorded nothing on parchment, for they distrusted permanence in physical form, instead passing everything orally to trusted students, instructing them never to centralize knowledge again, and to always assume that every system of preservation carries within it the seed of its own vulnerability. Long after their deaths, travelers along trade routes told stories of invisible libraries that existed only when people spoke together, and historians dismissed these as metaphor, not realizing they were describing a real intellectual inheritance that had shaped medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy across regions. And so the hidden history of the Library of Alexandria survivors is not a tale of lost books but of displaced minds, not of destruction but of diffusion. And if one listens carefully to the way ancient knowledge appears across unrelated cultures like scattered constellations forming a hidden pattern, it becomes possible to imagine that somewhere beneath history's surface there still exists a second library, not built of stone or papyrus, but of human memory continuously rewritten by those who carry fragments they do not always recognize as inheritance. And in that sense the library was never truly gone, it simply learned how to live without walls, without shelves, and without a single place to burn.